I appreciate you joining us. It's always good to talk to you and all your colleagues there at Everest Group. As you know, we've had a lot of esteem for you guys and covered your activities over the years. And you just came out with the 2023 edition of the Everest Group BPS Top 50. And I read the report. It's a really interesting report. I found some intriguing things in there. And I know that you guys, and one of the things that you do is it's not a capabilities report. It's not to say, oh, look, we're in the top right of this squares about this or that or whatever, but it's really looking more objectively at, okay, these are the biggest providers. What are the trends that we can notice in the industry? And you notice a slowing growth for top providers for the past in 2022 compared to 2021. I think that that growth slowed to around 8% from, I think the year before it was around 12.5%. And that's kind of scary. There's still growth, but it seems to be slowing down. And what would you attribute that to?
Yeah, actually, it's kind of three factors behind that, Torrent, right? The first factor is, in 21, there was a lot of these COVID-related spend, government contracts that came along, track and trace, contacts, and XYZ, right? So that actually was very helpful in driving 21 growth, but it's a one-time activity, right? So as that one-time activity attenuated, right? So that was one factor. The second factor was in the, see, all these, our comparison on USD, US dollars. Second factor was that US dollar actually grew very strongly, right, compared to other currencies, right? So meaningful, FX impact given major currency depreciated against the US dollars. So what happens because of that is, while you are making probably the similar money in euros or pounds, right, in USD it will look lower, right? And the third factor was, you're already coming out from a very high growth, 12.5% is pretty high, right? So it's kind of a base effect start to catch up. So it was, for us, as we look into it, it was not a kind of a very core structural issue, right? So let me kind of take a further step back. If you look at year 2020, right, that was a COVID hit year. So the growth actually came down meaningfully, right? So and 2021, what happened is there was this, so your base was actually came down. Possibly you were growing at 7-8%, whatever as an industry, it came down to 1-2%, right? And 21, you have this COVID induced, there are a lot of spend that was happening. On top of it, you had this government spend that came along, one time, very COVID specific spend that came along, which benefited, right? Which actually was not there in 2022, but the currency issue, right? Wherein the USD getting much more stronger compared to other currencies, right? And the higher base effect, all these things played out. So net of that is don't see any structural issue, right? In fact, as we're kind of looking to 2023, we expect the growth to be around the same number, right? And in this kind of a recessionary environment, if you can grow as an industry, or at least these 50 providers will grow at around 8%, that's pretty, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. So we don't see any structural issue here.
Do you think that you mentioned, sort of a recessionary environment? If we're in a global economic slowdown, is that going to cause the buy side to reduce their spend with outsourcers, or will it cause them to increase their spend by moving in-house operations to outsourcers at a cost-cutting move? I see kind of, a seesaw thing, like,
correct,
is it good for outsourcers or bad for outsourcers? How's that going? How would that work out?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, right? And again, we are sticking to BPO, right? Let's stick to BPO because,
right,
I'm excluding IT, right? Because then it becomes a different. Okay, so should we restrict it to BPO, right? Okay, good. So yeah, it's very interesting because, as when you're under a lot of cost pressure, BPO becomes a good route for you to lower the cost, right? So the way to look at it is, there are two spends that you need to look at from an enterprise perspective, right? And subsequently, what is coming to BPOs, right? One is the as-is spend, things that they are already outsourcing, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is also part of the spend, which comes into the industry.
Right.
Now, what happens is, let's say the transaction volume is coming down in the spend that they're already outsourced. Then your value, what is called annual contract value, or your ability to realize the full will come down. So that is the as is. And then you have net new organizations who have not done outsourcing, or they have not outsourced certain function. That is net new. So it's kind of a, but once we start to combine these two, what we are seeing is net new demand, right, is pretty strong, right? Because organizations who have not outsourced the function or have not outsourced, they're doing it. But specific pockets where the volume has come down because of recession, that is actually acting as a kind of negative factor. So for example, if you look at mortgage origination as a service, right, that is severely hampered while they are outsourced. Some providers were expecting to kind of, I'm just making it up, right, expecting $10 million, right, going into the year, because that's the kind of volume projection that they have had. But it has kind of going to come down to half because not much of origination is happening, right? So it becomes 5 million. But then there are other organizations who are kind of coming through saying, hey, I don't want to do it in-house, you can do it cheaper. So it's a kind of a combination, both the things kind of play out. On the net basis, we are saying, hey, the industry is going to grow at 78% in 2023, which is actually a pretty good number.
So I would imagine, let me guess, if we look at IT outsourcing, if we do go into an economic slowdown, then we would find that companies would maybe increase their level of technical debt. That's to say that, let's kind of hold off on these kind of infrastructure upgrades and things like that. So while it might be a net positive for business process outsourcing, specifically IT outsourcing, it might kind of really have a more of a negative
Correct.
effect.
Absolutely. That's why, we expect, in any economic downturn, Lauren, we have seen BPOs to remain resilient, right? Pretty good. While IT side, IT outsourcing takes a tumble, takes a hit, right?
Yeah.
Having said that, the one thing I will also make it more interesting, this time around, it is not going to be as severe hit in IT side compared to the previous downturns.
Okay.
The reason being, earlier IT was actually seen just as pure discretionary.
Right.
But today, technology is part of the fabric, right? You can't be doing it.
It's not 2008 anymore.
Correct. It is not 2008 anymore, and it's not considered as discretionary. You still want to kind of prioritize and prune the budget, but you are not going to stop it. This is the juggernaut that is continuing to roll. So the two-part story here. One is, yes, IT is going to be more impacted compared to business process outsourcing. But even if you're looking at IT, compared to previous downturns, it's going to be less impacted.
Now, we also saw, according to your report, that in the past year, IT grew strongly. I would imagine that that's kind of some of the effects that with COVID, a lot of companies were moving to remote environments and they had to put into place the infrastructure. And again, we talk about paying back your technological debt. A lot of companies did not have the infrastructure to properly support remote work when it comes to security, when it comes to being nimble and agile and having their workers work securely from anywhere. And so there's some companies that already kind of knew how to handle people working from all over the world remotely. They had, whether VPNs or SD-WANs or whatever other types of infrastructure already in place. And then we saw other companies that were scrambling, that were kind of starting from zero. And so I would imagine that what your report reflects was the boom that COVID created in certain sectors, especially across the board, but really especially when it comes to IT outsourcing, right?
Correct. Because to your point, as I said, what started digital transformation is not the CIO or CEO, right? COVID started that, right? So basically, so that part, absolutely, you are right.
I saw that, so you guys cover the top 50 when it comes to revenue combined. You have kind of a weighted formula where you look at 70% the revenues, plus then you have kind of a growth modifier in your methodology. Of the top 5, I noticed that 2 of them were, I don't think they're global firms. They might have operations globally, but their market, we look at ADP and Paychex, those are US payroll outsourcing companies, very, not really niche is not the right word, but very specific providers. They do they do a few things, but they focus on HR. They're not like, Accenture is also, I think, number 2, and Accenture does all kind of different things related around IT and consulting. But if you work for Accenture and your mom goes, what does Accenture do? You're going to have a little bit of a difficult time explaining in a comprehensive way. So I think it's interesting because then we saw you've got also 2 large Concentrics and Teleperformance, which are customer experience outsourcers. What does that tell us about the strategy of firms that are having success? Does that say that you're going to, if you focus on one area, whether it's HR outsourcing, whether it's Accenture, I kind of is around the way, but is it better to focus on one certain kind of delivery model, or is it better to work broadly? I guess, is it better to be horizontal or vertically oriented if you want to make it, if you're a growth firm and you want to make it into the top 10 or the top 50? What does that say about strategy?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? We call them specialist versus broad-based, right? So
Okay.
Accenture is a kind of broad-based, so it kind of offers so many things, while the likes of ADPs or Paychecks, HR specialists, and we can also term Teleperformance and Concentrics as specialists, though they do offer other services, but 80% of their revenues comes from So it's a very interesting question, and I think to me it is less about your portfolio, more about how are you creating value in what you do.
Okay.
Right. That is the more important thing. So if you look at, why Paychecks and ADP, right? Because they created this, platform which can, cater to the need of such a wide group of companies, right? In a model that is scalable,
Yeah.
right? That's fantastic, right? Versus Accenture, who is basically comes in and say, hey, look at your back office and mid office and transform your operations, right? So point I'm trying to make, Lauren, is it's less about your portfolio focus. It's more about, whatever that you have decided as a strategy, how well are you executing against that strategy, right? So to me, that's the key takeaway. I mean, I would just say one more thing, right? ADP, yes, a large part of their revenue is coming from the US, but ADP is actually now a pretty global company in the sense that they have something called, multi-country payroll, global payroll. So they kind of process payroll for a lot of other countries, right? So they kind of cater to the US headquartered company with a global setup, right? They will kind of cater to that, but they have also entered a lot of the countries. For example, they are in India as well, right? They're kind of processing payroll and all those things. But, that's a side remark. The core thing is, how well you execute against your strategy versus just what your strategy is.
Not what you do, but how you do it.
Correct. Correct.
As you were putting this together, you and your team at Everest Group, did you notice any surprising jumps? And did you notice any surprising falls? So when you're looking at the rank, you say, wow, look at this. We didn't expect that. This company has really shot up more, maybe even more than expected. Or did you see any surprising drops as you put the report together?
There are a couple of things which were kind of interesting, right? One is, if you look at some of these companies, right? And especially what I call this IT BPS company, who provide both IT services as well as BPO services, right? So I mean, we were talking about 3 kinds of segregation. One is specialists like your, ADPs and Paychecks and others. Second is your, the Teleperformance of the world, which is kind of, or Genpact of the world, right? Who provide, a lot of the BPO services. They provide some bit of IT services, but largely BPO services, right? And then you have what we call the IT BPS providers, right? So like Accenture is one of them. Infosys, Wipro, Tech Mahindra, IBM, all of these guys have significant IT capabilities and they have meaningful BPO capabilities as well, right? And that's kind of revenue mix. One of the interesting things with that we found, Lauren, is, for some of these companies, BPO is the growth engine. Though IT is the big brother.
Okay.
BPO is the growth engine. So for example, if you look at Tech Mahindra, right, which is the number 2 in terms of fastest growing, right, as you can see in our report. I'll have to go back and check their overall industry, the overall growth, right? So overall growth for them is, and I'll have to check when I can get back to you, right, is probably in the somewhere in single digit, right? But the BPO business grew 27%. And it has been kind of growing for some time in this high double digit, right? So the other example is someone like Cognizant, right?
Yeah.
Again, the IT is the big, but the IT growth has been kind of challenging. It's well known, right? Pretty challenging for them, right? Overall growth, if you look at it, has been pretty challenging. But the BPO business has grown very nicely, like 15 to 18%, what we are calling it, and actually now crossed 2 billion. IBM is another example, right? But we know IBM is a big tech powerhouse and all those things. But it's a BPO business, which is small, but nonetheless growing much, much faster, right? So this is very interesting, right? Now, how do you associate a particular company? You ask someone Tech Mahindra, they'll kind of say, okay, tech company. Cognizant, okay, IT company. IBM, IT company. But their BPO, which is kind of some very meaningful growth within their own organization.
That's interesting. It's fascinating because you look at companies that you see kind of a cycle. You'll see a tech company and they get these operations and then they spin off these operations. Remember, Xerox had outsourcing and then Xerox spun it off and said, okay, we're going to be a technology company. And then we're going to, just like they grow this, and then somebody comes along with the board changes or something and they go, oh, well, let's spin this off and focus on our core. And then a few years later, they develop it again. It's almost like this cycle of grow and spin off.
And this is the place where, again, this notion, see, I'll tell you the general notion is, hey, IT is sexy, IT is hot, right? That is the thing, right? That's the place we are missing here. What is the need in the market? Where can I kind of accelerate growth? It's not about this is hot and hence in the investor side, right? Of course, it's always a function of both revenue and margin, right? And IT margin generally tends to be better than BPO margin, right? Having said that, and I don't think I'm in a position to reveal, but some of these companies, their BPO margin, right, is better than their IT margin. So,
wow.
Point here is, again, some of these, this particular business is creating significant value for many organizations, many of these providers.
And I think what you said earlier can be kind of it's going to be a fulcrum for this, because if IT spending slows and BPO spending increases, then that's going to really change the relationship inside of some of these broad-based firms between IT and BPO. And that's going to be really fascinating to watch. And we're going to have to bring you back here in a few months to talk about that.
Absolutely. And now, yeah, that is definitely happening. The BPOs and the organizations definitely going up within their own organization, their value, right? And value perception is going up, right? Which is true for any other. So absolutely right.
It's going to be interesting to watch this. You put together a great report. Everest Group always does. I really enjoyed reading this one. I think it's very useful. Let's continue to keep in touch, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Lauren.